Great. Good morning, Great. Good morning, everyone. Everybody can hear me, see me? Great. Thank you so much for having us. Juan Sebastian, it's good to be here. Great to be in front of everyone this morning. And we're going to take this opportunity to discuss and provide an overview of what the blended finance ecosystem looks like, where it's headed, and what role Convergence plays in that sense. So I'll start sharing my screen now. I'll be managing the presentation, and I'll give a brief overview of the SDGs and who we are, and then we'll have a little deeper dive with Akif from then on. I guess we can leave the questions for the end, and if there are any issues regarding the language or clarification of a term, and it maybe makes more sense to expand or elaborate on that in Spanish, glad to do so. So give me 1 second, please. I need to have the able to share the screen, please.
Try again, please. I think I give you the permission.
Does that work?
Yeah, everything okay.
Okay. So towards the end of the millennium, last millennium, and towards the beginning of this millennium, the focus on development activity and development aid and development projects was centered around what were the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And that relied heavily on the participation, specifically on DFIs, either the World Bank, IDB, the African Development Bank, etc. And that took up quite a bit of the first part of the decade. Let's fast forward a little bit towards 2015, when there was a relaunch of these initiatives and this focus and this target to see how we could move the needle in the development space and what that would look like. And that is when the SDGs in 2015 were adopted, the 17 goals that provided each a guidance as to where the gaps were as far as inequality, poverty, and economic opportunities. And that has been sort of the guidance and is the guidance up until 2030 as to where the development activity should be focused on. So based on the information that we have, the gap that is, the financial gap that is needed in order to finance these SDGs is around the order of $2.5 trillion. That was pre-pandemic. So post-pandemic, it's probably more along the lines of $3.5 trillion in order to be able to finance and close this gap. That's a huge number, especially when you consider the fact that the official development assistance in 2020 was only 161 billion. So we're roughly talking about 5 to 10% of the ODA financing is applicable for the SDG. So there's a huge gap. So where is that rest of the money or the funding going to come from if the ODA is only financing 5 to 10% of that? Well, that's the big question, and the idea is to see how and where we can tap into additional resources to fill in that gap. And just as another piece of information, the data that we've come across and collected shows that there is an average of the average of leverage created when you bring in the private sector and you tie it up with concessional capital is around 5-fold. So when you use a blended finance structure, which we'll get into in more detail later in the presentation, there is a possibility to leverage that ratio of capital on a 5-to-1 basis when you combine it in a blended finance structure. So what is Convergence? Well, as I mentioned, in 2015, the SDGs were deployed, and Convergence was created in 2015 in order to promote the blended finance ecosystem and to encourage the use and the participation of different deals and activities as one of the tools, as one of the structuring approaches to finance the SDGs. We are a membership-based organization. We are a nonprofit. Our headquarters are in Toronto, and we focus on 3 different pillars of activity. One of the pillars has to do with the gathering of information blended finance. We have 2 initiatives in that sense, in the sense of the gathering of information on the platform that we manage. One has to do with historic deals that we've collected throughout the years. Those are in excess of 700 deals that we have in our database. And we also have the possibility of posting active deals in the blended finance space that are looking to secure financial backing or financial involvement. The other pillar of activity has to do with knowledge sharing and information sharing, whether it's writing data briefs, whether it's writing specific case studies on the activities that are taking place in the blended finance space. It's providing trainings, it's providing workshops and participating in panels to be focused on the knowledge sharing space. And finally, the third area of activity that we have centers around managing design fund windows from different grantees. We have 4 of those. Those are flow-through grants that we manage on behalf of our donors, and we are in charge of managing the RFPs and providing a short list of who the best participants or best proposals in our view are, so that the donors can go ahead and fund those windows. So those are the 3 different pillars of activity that we have at Convergence. This is a brief snapshot of how our member composition is based. And we can get into a little bit more of what the blended finance space looks like now. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Akif, the Director of Engagement and Training at Convergence. Akif?
Great, thank you, Heiner. Can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes.
You can? Okay, excellent, fantastic. So we're going to spend the next 20 odd minutes walking through the various first principles around blended finance. What actually is this concept? What are the various different constituent parts of this particular structuring approach? And then what are some trends insofar as blended finance application in Latin America is concerned? I'm also cognizant that we want to leave some time for question and answers and for a dialogue and a discussion. So I'll go through this, and I apologize, my Spanish is not that great. So in case there's any clarification questions, or in case I use terms that you're not familiar with, you can post them in the chat box, and then Heiner can maybe answer in Spanish, or you can even ask a question for clarification. Heiner can reply in Spanish. So what is blended finance? Blended finance is really the use of, as you can see on your screen, development funding from public and or philanthropic sources. So this could be foundations, this could be donor agencies, governments. So it's the use of development funding on concessional terms or on non-market terms or on asymmetrical terms, with the express intent and purpose of mobilizing or catalyzing private capital that's sitting on the sidelines on market terms into blended finance structures. So let me repeat that one more time. It is the use of development funding on concessional terms to mobilize private capital on market terms into blended finance structures. Now you're probably wondering, what does concessionality even mean in this context? So concessionality has a range of different levers. It could be a consideration of pricing, it could be a consideration of tenor extension, it could be a consideration of any tweaks or adjustments or amendments to market accepted terms and conditions that would make it non-concessional. So for example, you might be an equity holder in a particular fund or in a particular social enterprise, and you might say, I am going to cap my return to X percentage, and anything that accrues over and above that would go to other investors. Or from the case of equity, again, you might say, even though I'm an equity holder, I will forego any dividends, and all the dividends can go to other investors. Or for example, if you are providing a loan, you might say, I'll provide a loan for up to 7 years, but I'll only make sure the pricing is for 5 years, and the extra 2 years of tenor extension, that extra risk will not be priced in to the pricing that I provide in terms of the interest rate. So concessionality could mean a whole range of different things. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just a function of pricing, it's a function of anything that is non-market, so to speak. Next slides, please. So now this slide really shows us the beauty and power of blended finance. If you can see, there's three typical forms of funding. We've got aid and philanthropy on one end, purely concessional, and we've got commercial investors on one end, looking for market-beating net returns. And in the middle, you got impact investors and social investors, who are loosely and broadly defined, so to speak. And as you can see, these typical forms of funding have various different characteristics in terms of return expectations, liquidity requirements, risk appetites, and so on. And what blended finance does a very neat job of is it brings all these various different forms of financing into one structure while ensuring that each particular form of funding takes on a risk return profile that's comfortable to them. So for example, aid and philanthropy, purely 100% financial trade-off. They are able to take on a lot more risk. Commercial investors obviously are able to take on only risk-adjusted return positions. And so everybody takes on a profile that's acceptable to them whilst achieving their own objectives. And so that's really, really important, because the objective of aid and philanthropy is develop and impact. The objective of commercial investors is seeking alpha. And so all these various forms of funding are able to abide by their own North Star, so to speak, whilst at the same time being comfortable with their position in the shareholding stack. Next slide, please. Now, as you can see on the screen over here, there are various different barriers or various different risks, so to speak, that prevent capital from flowing into emerging markets, flowing into developing countries. As you can see, liquidity, the ease at which we can enter or exit a particular investment, the lack of local financial markets not functioning very efficiently, and hence you don't have price discovery or good data and information, or even knowledge and capability gaps of private investors, FX risk, political risk, as you're probably well aware in Colombia of late. Also, individual deal sizes too small, and also private investors having a limited mandate or an incentive. There's many private investors that we speak to that are very interested and eager to participate in blended finance transactions. But for example, if you're talking about insurance companies or pension funds, they have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize risk-adjusted returns. And so they are just not able to participate by their very nature in certain transactions, because they need, they have an investment grade mandate in terms of choosing certain investments are concerned. So all this is to say there's very many challenges, risks, and barriers that prevent capital from flowing into the geographies that we all work in. So naturally, the question is, well, what do you do? How do you structure around these challenges? How do you solve for these challenges? And so at the end of the day, it's really, really important to understand, well, what do private investors actually keep in mind? And as maybe you're well aware, that risk and return are the two main paradigms along which private investors make capital allocation decisions. That's all they care about. What is the level of risk? And if you're asking me to take on this level of risk, well, the return has to be commensurate with the risk that you're asking me to take on. So risk and return are the most important elements along which private investors make capital allocation decisions. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So as you can see, in the markets that we work in, risk and returns are not in balance. And we spoke about the various barriers or the levels of risks. But as you can see, returns as well for any investment, whether it's a debt investment or whether it is an equity investment, the returns on that investment are a function of where I am in the capital structure. If it's a function of debt, how long am I providing the debt for? For debt and equity as well, am I able to move in and out of these kind of transactions? What is the growth rate of the business or the fund? And so on and so forth. So as you can see, risk-adjusted returns in many of these markets are out of balance for these investors. And so we have to bring them in line with with generally accepted other investments that we're asking investors to take on. Let's think about this for a second. If I'm asking a US-based investor or a European-based investor to invest in Colombia or to invest in Bolivia, whether it is equity or debt, we must not forget that there is an opportunity cost for their money. Whilst they are looking at this particular investment in Colombia or in Bolivia, they are also looking at comparable investments in their own markets or comparable investments in other markets, maybe in Brazil, maybe in Peru. And so there is an opportunity cost for their money. And so we have to be cognizant about making sure that risk-adjusted returns are attractive or as attractive to the other opportunities that these investors have. So that's another important point to keep in mind. So what do you do when you have so many different risks and so many different barriers? Can we go on to the next slide, please? So that's really when you actually enter into the world of blended finance and structure for these challenges that I spoke about. At its very core, at its very essence, blended finance is nothing more and nothing less than a financial structuring approach. To do what? To either shift or mitigate risks, and on the other side of the equation, to manage returns. And as you can see, you can either shift risks or you can mitigate risks. Again, there's a little bit of a nuance between shifting a risk to somebody else versus mitigating or reducing the absolute level of that risk. And so as you can see, you can shift risks in a few different ways. You can provide a first loss mechanism and limit downside loss exposure to some of the more commercially oriented investors, or you can improve the creditworthiness of a particular transaction, thereby making the transaction more viable or bankable for an investor. Or you can provide some sort of a guarantee or an insurance against an unforeseen event or against a certain level of losses, for example. Or you can also provide technical assistance through the form of grants or advisory and capacity building services to strengthen the implementation of a particular project. Because if the quality of a particular project's implementation is strengthened, the likelihood of the project paying back that investor, or if it's in the case of an equity transaction, the ability of that project to achieve market-beating returns will be enhanced. And on the return side, you can top up returns, you can link returns, or you can link returns rather to the achievement of successful impact and provide incentives then for successful performance outcomes. So there's various ways in which you can shift or mitigate risks and or manage or massage returns. Now, from all the transactions that we see, from all the work that we do, most of the foundations or donors prefer to be the business of shifting risks rather than managing returns. And as you can imagine, from the perspective of donors, whether it's the US aid, or even CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, or others, they'd much rather be in the business of shifting risks rather than managing returns, because there is a perception when it comes to managing returns. If you're managing returns, enhancing the upside for investors, there is a perception that you are enhancing the returns for investors, or you are subsidizing the returns for investors. And if you are the custodian of public funds, then that is something that you have to be careful about from a perception perspective. But ultimately, whether you're shifting risks or managing returns, it all gets you to the same point, which is the ability to shift the risk-return trade-off for commercial investors such that they are now comfortable and able to invest in a transaction that they would not have been able to invest in or participate in otherwise. That's very, very key and important to underscore, because we need good practice blended finance transactions. We need to make sure that these transactions are pursuant to minimum concessionality or some sort of principles around additionality as well. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, risk and returns are the paradigm along which investors make capital allocation decisions. And as you can see, this is basically the capital asset pricing model that we all learn in Finance 101, or if you've not learned, it's very, very straightforward and very simple. This is the framework that investors use when they make decisions to invest. And as you can see, risk is on the x-axis, return is on the y-axis, like we spoke about earlier. And this blue dot on the left-hand side, it says risk-free return. It's essentially a US Treasury bond or any Treasury bond in that sense. Zero or absolutely low risk and a very, very modest return. And as commercial investors have a fiduciary responsibility of maximizing risk-adjusted returns, any transaction that they will support or that they should support will lie on this blue line. That's an upward sloping blue line. So a combination of transactions lie on the blue line. Now, unfortunately, all the transactions that we come across in these challenging geographies to work in fall on the right-hand side of the blue line. And therefore, these transactions are unacceptable to a private investor. So as I mentioned, you can either shift risks, move from A to B, or you can move from A to C and enhance the return, or a combination thereof. But essentially what an investor is looking for us to do, if you have development capital at your disposal, is to try and get the transaction from A to something onto the blue line that's acceptable for them to then participate. Otherwise, they're just not able to participate because they're not able to maximize their own risk-adjusted returns. So I just wanted to share this with you because it's an important framework for us to think about. How do investors think? How do they approach it? And many of you, some of you are working with investors as well. Some of you are investors, so you have an idea and understanding that these are the frameworks that they use. These are the language that investors use when they are assessing transactions or looking to make an investment. Next slide, please, Heino. So the next couple of slides show you some of the flavors of blending. So as you can see, there are various flavors of blending, and it's important for me to mention that these flavors do not exist in silos. Oftentimes, I will see a transaction that will have concessional debt or equity, but then also has benefited from a design funding grant right at the outset. Or it might have a guarantee and it might have technical assistance and so on and so forth. But there's various different flavors of blending, and I'll go through them very, very briefly in the interest of time. So you have concessional debt or equity, which is essentially financing within the capital structure, as you can see, to change the risk return trade-off or ratio for senior investors or for more commercially oriented investors. And essentially what this does is it helps to reduce the weighted average cost of capital of transactions such that transactions are now much more bankable than they would have been able to be otherwise. That's essentially what concessional debt or equity is doing. It's within the capital structure and it's altering the risk return for the blue slices, as you can see. And again, the concessional element is a function of pricing. It could be a function of amending terms and conditions such that the risk return changes for senior investors. When it comes to guarantee and insurance, again, very, very efficient, because guarantee and insurance are only deployed when they actually when the guarantees on insurance products are actually called or they're actually triggered. But they're very useful because they help to narrow the gap between the perception of risk and the reality of risk. If I'm able to guarantee or insure the loan book of a financial institution that's doing some great work in Colombia, and we want them to lend to Colombian women-owned SMEs, they might perceive women-owned SMEs to have a high degree of risk. But we might know from our work in other geographies that that's not really the case. But these banks don't have the data in Colombia, for example. So if I'm able to guarantee or insure a certain percentage of their loan book, they have a lot more comfort to go out and lend to women-owned SMEs. And hopefully the more lending that they do, the more they will realize that there is that gap between the perception of what they think a risk is and the reality of a risk. And so guarantees are a great product to help to bridge that gap. And also, of course, very, very capital efficient because, again, money is not dispersed until the guarantees are actually called or the insurance products are actually triggered, as an example. And they're triggered or called based on a certain criteria, which we can go into another time. Now, design, preparation, or grant funding, as you can see, it is the provision of grants to transactions or to various different projects, but right at the outset, because a lot of the risk, think about project finance, right? A lot of the risk for the transactions that we all work in are coming right at the outset. If you're putting together a solar power plant, you need to identify the right technology, you need to identify the right site, you need to sign a power purchase agreement, you need to begin construction. There could be cost overruns. There could be time overruns as well. And so a lot of the risks in these transactions are front loaded right at the outset. And also sometimes a lot of the risks in these transactions are because these transactions have not been proved, or we don't know the feasibility of these transactions. And so one can benefit from a grant right at the outset to test or to design a transaction from a proof of concept perspective or a feasibility perspective, so that hopefully the transaction will benefit from this grant and then move along its life cycle and be more commercial in orientation. Next slide, please, Heine. And then, as you can see, we also have technical assistance. That's a flavor of blending, sits outside the capital structure. And as I mentioned, this is a grant that is provided potentially to an investee of a particular fund, to maybe a project itself, if it's a project finance transaction, to really strengthen the quality of the implementation of the transaction for the reasons I mentioned earlier. You can also provide a grant to support or to subsidize the project cost support of a particular transaction. So for example, think about viability gap funding. You might have a slight difference between what it takes you for cost recovery of a particular transaction to what you are able to charge. So think about a water transaction. If you're putting in all the piping, all the filtration systems, all the actual infrastructure itself, it does cost money. I know water is supposed to be free, but water also, is expensive to transport. It's expensive to pipe and distribute, and so there are costs that are, that come with this. And so, oftentimes, in a politically sensitive subject like water, you are not able to charge cost recovery based on all the infrastructure investments that you've made. And so, you could have something which is called a viability gap funding. You could have a donor that comes in and that subsidizes the gap between what you're able to charge and what you actually need to break even, as an example. Or you could also have results-based financing transactions, which is essentially a different way of thinking. The way of thinking is, you need to move away, at least from a donor's perspective, from paying for inputs and paying for outputs to paying for actually tangible results-oriented outcomes. And so developing impact bonds, social impact bonds, or if you're familiar with social impact incentives, are other ways in which you can work through results-based financing as well. So I just wanted to give you a very high-level flavor of the various different ways in which one can blend. And as I mentioned earlier, many transactions have a combination of all these various elements. And we can have individual sessions on all these different elements themselves. We can spend a whole hour speaking about results-based financing if we have the time. Heine, next slide, please. Maybe Heine will skip through this in the interest of time. I can go through some of the other slides. So if you're probably wondering, if you are UNDP, Lena, I see you on the conversation, or if you are maybe an impact investor, or if you are a representative from a bank, well, how can blended finance support your transactions? How can it make your life easier and your job easier? Well, number one, it can really help to develop a steady pipeline, a stream of bankable projects, as I mentioned earlier. Or if you are really focused on mobilizing or catalyzing private investment for the SDGs, this particular structuring approach can really help to mobilize and to bring in and to crowd in that capital that's sitting on the sidelines. Or if you have a great transaction that's purely commercial in orientation, but you want to attract some sort of technical assistance for that particular transaction, then this could also help you with that. And last but by no means the least, as I mentioned earlier, it all boils down to either mitigating or shifting risks and or enhancing returns for projects, such that the overall weighted average cost of capital comes down, and transactions or projects that needed a higher hurdle rate to meet that threshold of bankability now are much more palatable than they would have been otherwise. So various ways in which this can be supportive of your own organization's mandates. And we're happy to discuss this again in more detail as we move on. Next slide, please. Now, it's also important for me to mention that blended finance is not the silver bullet solution to all of the problems that we face. There's a huge SDG funding gap. Blended finance is one of the tools in the toolkit. There will be an ongoing need for development grants. There will be an ongoing need for other instruments in the development toolkit. Blended finance is not the be all and end all of development finance. It is just one of the tools in the development toolkit. So it's important for me to mention this as well. You need to ask yourselves the questions around what risks am I looking to solve for? What development challenge am I looking to actually, work on? Is it a function of FX risk? Is it getting more transactions over to be bankable? Is it strengthening the implementation of projects? So once you ask yourselves these questions, and only once you have the right answers, is when you actually need to then deploy or use blended finance. So important for me to mention this, that it is one tool in the development toolkit. It is not the be all and end all of impact investing and of development finance. Next, please. So just to quickly cover, as I think Heine mentioned earlier, Convergence has the world's largest repository of historical blended finance transactions. We collect this information from publicly available information sources. We collect this information from scraping the internet, from databases, from press releases, and so on. And we also have information sharing agreements and arrangements with the whole range of other actors like the OECD. And so we have a bottom-up and a top-down way of collecting information. We have 700 odd transactions. And as you can see, to date, we have around 112 transactions that we've captured from the Latin American region. And as you can see, there has been a steady flatlining in terms of the number of transactions, between around 8 to 10 transactions from around 2013 to 2020. And as you can see in 2021, the number of transactions that came over the finish line, these are all closed and have reached financial close, have been reduced because of COVID. A lot of the emergency financing was rightfully so directed to strengthening health systems, strengthening education systems, and all the other systems that were proven to be very, very fragile from a grant perspective. And now as we move to build back better, we definitely recognize and see the importance of actually bringing in more capital, because there's a recognition that all of the philanthropy in the world, all of the official development assistance in the world is only a drop in the bucket in service of the SDG funding gap that we have. And so as you can see, 15.9 billion in total aggregate financing towards the LAC region, nearly not enough. And that's also one of the huge problems that we faced in blended finance. Too many transactions are just too small. They are just too small, and we need to think about how do we actually scale these transactions? How do we actually replicate these transactions? And how do we have a standardized approach to thinking about supporting and funding these transactions? Because look, if we want to mobilize the largest pools of capital, the pension funds and insurance companies, they really want to invest in and support products that they're familiar with, that they're comfortable with, that they've seen before. The more bells and whistles, the more uncomfortable they are. And so we need to move towards an ecosystem that has standardization, that has data, that has good practice, and has robust principles built in. So as we move towards those systems, we will definitely hope to see a steady increase and an uptake in the number of transactions reaching financial close. And we are seeing that in other more evolved and more mature geographies. Next slide, please. Now, as you can see, in terms of the sectors, energy and agriculture are the most common sectors in terms of blended finance activity in Latin America. And this is because it all comes down to which transactions or which sectors are investable. At the end of the day, let's go back to the definitions. We're looking to mobilize private investors, but private investors are looking for a return, and hence they need to see business models that have cash flows that can pay them back. Well, in the energy space, or in the agri space, or in the financial services space, or even in the infrastructure space, you do have transactions or business models that can pay back investors. Let's think about climate adaptation rather. In the mitigation sphere, whether it's a wind farm or a solar farm or geothermal, it's very straightforward. You put some infrastructure together, plug it, hook it up to the grid, generate some sort of electricity or some sort of energy. You get paid for that, and that's how the system works, and that's how the closed loop works. But in the case of climate adaptation, when it comes to dry seawalling or protecting mangroves, there's not very clearly identifiable business models, as you can see. And hence, sectors or subjects or SDGs, for example, peace, justice, and strong institutions. I know you have a couple of transactions within the UN on this particular topic in Colombia. But broadly speaking, you do not have many business models that can pay back investors or that have those kind of cash flows. And that's why you see sectors that have or that are more investable in orientation is where you see most of the action taking place. So you don't see a whole lot of action in energy or health or education as compared to energy for the reasons that I mentioned. And so you need to see a lot more business model evolution as well, which is why we need to support a broader range of sectors than the ones you're seeing on the screen. Next slide, please. And when it comes to most frequently targeted countries where we see most of the activity to date, again, no surprises for guessing middle-income countries like Mexico, Colombia, Peru, where investors are already somewhat comfortable or already have some knowledge, is where we see, again, most of these transactions taking place till date. So Central America, not as much action as compared to some of the more established or evolved countries, especially in terms of the investment ecosystem. Next slide, please, Heiner. And if you look at the specific deals database when it comes to Colombia, as I showed you earlier, 34 transactions mobilized a reasonable amount of financing to date. And as you can see, we had a couple of examples: Kingo Energy, Terabella Colombia Fund, the Acumen Latin America Early Growth Fund. And so, from the limited amount of time that even I've spent in the region and in Colombia and speaking to many Colombian stakeholders as well, there is a lot going on in Colombia. There is a lot of discussion, a lot of dialogue, a lot of discourse, a lot of stakeholders who want to get involved in this space. We just need more clarity of action, clarity of purpose, more capacity, more data, more information, and more information sharing arrangements and agreements with all these different actors as well. The UN system and the UN folks are very, very active and involved. Impacto, you guys at the NAB, FDN. So there's so much going on in Colombia that we really, really want to work with the Colombian ecosystem to make sure that everybody's sharing information, speaking to each other. Because look, at the end of the day, blended finance is all about SDG 17. And Heiner, if you can go to the next slide, please, the last slide. And as you can see, at the end of the day, this is all about bringing everyone together. You have to bring in concessional capital providers. You have to bring in commercial capital providers, impact investors, commercial investors. But also, let's not forget, you have to bring in governments as well to build the enabling ecosystem. So it's not just a conversation we need to have about supporting a particular transaction. We also have to have conversations about supporting an ecosystem to get the transaction to bankability, or to even get a transaction structured at the outset. And so a lot of next steps to institutionalize, scale, and mainstream this approach is required. What we've listed on your screen are just some of these. And Convergence is working on some. I know colleagues at the NAB are working on the others. And so again, I'll stop here in the interest of time, see if you have any questions. But again, thank you to NAB and the colleagues on the line for inviting us, for welcoming us here. And also to all of you for being patient listeners and for joining today. So I'm happy to take any questions and have any feedback on this conversation.
Thank you very much, Akif.
So please feel free to unmute yourself, ask a question in the microphone, ask a question in the chat box. You can ask it in Spanish, you can ask it in English, ask in another language as well. We'll figure it out. But please, if you have any questions, please let us know. Any clarification or even any thoughts that you might have on what I've just said or what Heiner has just said.
Juan, I have a question for you. I don't know if for you or for Akif. My name is Juan. I'm working for UNDP Colombia. I have worked for the public sector for the last 10 years, I think. This is my first experience with the UN agencies. Before, I worked with the Mobility Secretary, with the Mobility Ministry, the Social Secretary. And in my experience, well, I always saw this kind of PPPs, public-private partnerships, for example, for mobility projects, mostly. But right now I'm trying to understand how the blended finance concept might match with the needs of the public sector. In the last slide, for example, Akif mentioned that public investors might need to acquire new knowledge about these kind of things. And I think that that's the idea of us being here. And my question for Juan is, in your experience in Colombia, do you think that the public sector, I don't know, the Bogota agencies or Medellin or the main cities have the proper knowledge to advance in this kind of figure of blended finance? There are a good example, for instance, Juan?
Let me just jump in, Juan, before you jump in as well, just to make sure the distinction is clear between public-private partnerships and blended finance.
For me, it's clear.
Public-private partnerships, but for others as well, just generally as well, because sometimes I see people asking about both these terms. Public-private partnerships is essentially a contracting approach. That's essentially what it's a legal approach. It's a legal contracting system. It may or may not have concessionality embedded within it. When it has concessionality embedded, then it becomes blended. So that is the slight definition. They are overlapping in essence. So I just wanted to bring that caveat, Juan David, before Juan, you can jump in and answer the question about, I guess, capacity within agencies in Bogota.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think that the really challenge in Colombia, because in these public partnerships, I mean, it's not a blended finance as Akif mentioned, but it's a mix of capital sources that are deployed in a public projects. I think that the challenge it's to get the private equity into. Two the challenges. The first one is how we have a conversation between the private equity and the public expenditure in the same blended finance project. And when I say blended, I also think that it's important to define how this vehicle it's thinking in impact, right? Not only in profits on in expenditure, but also in impact, because most of the you have the public partnerships from the develop of some infrastructure project. It's generating impact, but it's not planning to do it. It's just, if you build a road or a highway, of course you make a lot of work and labor, and it's developed a lot of the place where it's built, but not necessarily is made by the impact approach. So I think that we need to have these two conversations: how we structure these APPs or public partnerships alliance with impact scope and approach, and then how we show this as an opportunity from the private equity as well.
Thank you, Juan. But my question is mainly because I'm trying to understand, along with Lina, how UNDP may work with, for instance, the Bogota City Hall or Medellin, in a project along with migrants, with Venezuelan migrants, which are basically working in the streets in recycling. They are collecting, the cardboards or all these kind of things, plastics, but that's totally informal. And we in my head, I'm trying to see if it's possible to create a vehicle to put the City Hall, UNDP, migrant associations, and to find the right capital to invest in a kind of association, a migrant association, or I don't know. But what I'm trying to understand right now is if Bogota has the experience, or the City Hall has the experience, or the city agencies have the experience, or we need to put them here with us to discuss how to create a blended finance vehicle for these kind of things. That was basically my questions, to figure out if you have any experience with the city.
Well, the answer is not really.
No.
Yeah.
No, but it's interesting for me, and I think that I will reach you out in the coming future, maybe to discuss how to do it, if it's possible or not.
No,
Thank you.
And maybe Maria Andrea, I know you are right now in Colcapital, but you used to work in Colombia, and maybe I think that the Invest in Bogota and us in Medellin should play an important role, because they are trying to have more private investors and private equity in their cities. So maybe, I don't know how you think we can engage with them to develop this kind of vehicles, to develop with projects from the cities.
Yes, Juan, I agree. I totally agree. There are another entities that are related to private equity and these kind of opportunities, and absolutely we can do like that contact between the other entities and look for opportunities in terms of private equity and investment and this kind of finance.
Thank you, Maria Andrea.
Hola.
Hola.
Did you hear me?
Sí, María Andrea, te escuchamos.
Ah, okay.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments or thoughts? And Juan David, I've posted in the chat box an example of a blended transaction that's focused on migrants, specifically in Jordan, and that can work also in Colombia. So this is, again, I think we also need good examples, because what's worked in many geographies can be easily replicated in the context of Colombia. And so I think a lot needs to be also done, and maybe NAB can support with this as well, in terms of how do we actually showcase some of these transactions to various different stakeholders so that they understand what has worked overseas, what has not worked, and then can adapt something similar to the Colombian context as well.
I don't see any other additional questions on the chat. I don't know if anybody else just wants to flag a question or touch on a specific subject that was of interest or not clear.
Please, go
Andres?
Juan and Keith, thank you for putting together this conversation. My name is Andres Esparza. I'm representing Impacto. What I found most interesting is that we have to start, and listening to Juan David, we need to start having more conversation. Colombia definitely needs to talk together from different partners of the ecosystem. We need to talk with private investors, to ONGs, beneficiaries, government. So there's not like a recipe. We need to work together. This, I find truly interesting that we start moving and growing this conversation. Also, we have Capital, which has possibility to move private equity. So thank you guys. I would like to contact probably, if it's possible, to Juan David and try to have a second conversation. How can we design and discuss possibilities to create those vehicles and gather those conversations, identify which entities are interested, for instance, in migration. We have a community of practice and impact community for migrants. So gladly to talk to you guys. And Juan, thank you once again for this webinar.
Thank you, Andres. I have another question. Maybe right now we are working in a policy recommendation from the new government, because we know, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty in Colombia about what is going to happen. But what we know is that there is an ambitious social and environmental approach from the new government, for example, in net zero and renewable energies. So I think that it sounds that match really well from the new government plans. There is any policy tools or recommendations that other countries, and maybe you can share it to us, because it should be really interesting to implement some recommendations regarding to blended finance in this policy paper that we are going to give to the new government. So I don't know, maybe you are working something like that.
Yeah, no, good point, Juan David. Especially when it comes to climate, this year is pretty much the year of, I think every year should be the year of climate. But for our blended finance report that's coming out in next couple of months, we're going to have a series of policy recommendations in there with respect to what governments and other agencies need to do insofar as climate policies and regulation is concerned around getting more transactions supported. Also, and maybe you can keep it close touch with Heiner on this, but we are in the process of writing a report for the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. I don't know if the Colombian finance minister is one of these. I think there's 60, 70 finance ministers. I'm assuming Colombia will be part of this list. But this is actually a policy recommendations to all the various different governments, specifically ministries of finance, around what do you actually need to do from a climate action perspective to get more capital in these kind of blended transactions. So once that's ready, Heiner can more than happy to share that and circulate that with you, and that could feed into your recommendations to the new government as well. And maybe Heiner, I don't know if you want to share this forum, what our ideas are in terms of our work with Colombia and what we have planned for the next few months as well, what we're discussing, because that also might neatly feed into this.
Yeah, thank you, Akif. I just want to echo the words you mentioned before, that there is a lot of potential in Colombia and a lot of opportunities to deploy different vehicles in the investment space, and one of them being blended finance. And if there is that overlap, and there is in certain sectors, in certain areas, for the need for a blended finance structuring approach, that could be a very strong solution. And again, I would echo also on the need of bringing different parties to the table from the beginning, so that everybody's speaking the same language and they're managing the same expectation. And I believe there's space and there's a need for everyone to participate and a role for everyone to play in that sense. And as Convergence, we stand ready to promote and to support the development of the ecosystem, not just in Colombia, but also at a regional level as well. In many instances, Colombia has always been seen as a reference or as a sub-regional leader, if you will, in the northern part of South America, and glad to support the activities in that sense any way we can.
And Juan, about the paper for the government, we have been working in a couple of policy papers, for instance, in migration, peace building, and I think that environmental issues. So I think it might be an opportunity for you. And I think that Lina may be a vehicle to work along with the United Nations in this kind of paper. Maybe it will be very well appreciated from, I don't know, the Ministry of Environmental or the Ministry of Energy. I don't know, but I think it's a good idea. I know that the priority of this government is enabling the energy transition, to create vehicles to boost the rural development, but also human mobility. I don't know if within the general scope that Akif was showing before, because general had 20 initiatives, but you don't know general, what does it mean? But education is also a priority for this government. So there are plenty of things that might interest to the new government, and we are totally open to discuss and to support.
Thank you, Juan. Yeah, actually, we are doing this with. I mean, it's a recommendation from the ecosystem, and Lina and UNDP. It's playing a really important role in this project as well. So No, thank you very much. I mean, there's a lot of things to do about blended finance. I think that it's a really important approach to deploy more private equity into the social and environmental issues in Colombia. So thank you very much. I think that this is the beginning of a bigger conversation that is starting today in our country, and we really appreciate your time. We'll be happy to keep in touch and working together in deploying this agenda in Colombia. Thank you very much, everybody.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Gracias.
And if
Thank you.
you need additional contact
you.
information from us, Juan Sebastián, you have our contact information. I kept in mind and glad to continue conversations offline. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you very much for the space.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Thank